Hi, it's Luke without a darts. Today we're going to show you how to mod your Nerf Hyper Mach-100. Now, this video is going to be a little different than normal because this blaster has already been modded, so I'm essentially going to show you the process as it were, but a lot of the junk has already been removed. So I'm not going to be able to show you the removal of this stuff, but rest assured I'll walk you through it and show it as we go along, just to make it a little easier on you. Before we get started, I want everybody to be really careful with LiPo batteries. Make sure that you understand, and down in the description we'll have a link to a full page on how to handle batteries. They can be extremely dangerous and definitely need to be handled with care. This is not an exclusive list. This is a card that we actually tape to your battery when you buy it. There are also warnings on the XT60 connector, the battery itself, the packaging, the manual, and on the listings for the LiPo. So do be careful. Take it seriously. Don't just toss them in a bag and ignore these warnings. We are going to mod this blaster to an XT60 connector. Now, I really want to stress that you need to mod at your own risk. I have modded and played with this a bit with a 3S LiPo that's about 12 volts, and I have found that I personally think that 3S is actually going to burn out the motors. On 3S, you're going to get about 145 feet per second. And on 2S, which I think is very safe long-term for the blaster, you're going to get something more like 120, 125. So a minor improvement, but then you don't have to use the original stock batteries. Some people might ask, why wouldn't I just tie in directly to these battery terminals and upgrade it that way without rewiring it? And the reason you wouldn't want to do that is because of all of this. When we plugged a LiPo directly to this, we didn't get anywhere near the same performance, and it is because of these PTCs here. They are actually clamping down on current. A little bit more on those later. So again, I don't think 3S is viable long-term, so please keep that in mind when you are doing this and you are modding at your own risk. Don't email me telling me you ruined your blaster and you're mad at me. It's really disheartening if people aren't listening from the start. That said, if you do rewire this, I am looking at motor options, cage options, flywheel options for this blaster to improve it across the board. We're also looking at doing a hop-up for the muzzle to see whether that's possible to upgrade and improve the accuracy. So let's get right to it here. First, I'm going to talk about the tools you need. You're going to need a soldering iron. You're going to want snips or flush cutters or a Dremel or a combination of both, depending on your preference. You'll need solder, safety glasses. You'll need wire strippers of some kind. It's also nice to have a hobby knife or X-Acto blade around. You'll need some heat shrink, 2 21 amp switches. I like one button switch and one lever switch for this particular install. And I'm going to use my custom designed switch plate for this blaster. Now, of course, you can just epoxy this in, but this is an option on the shop. Additionally, you're going to need one XT60 connector to complement your battery. This is the male side of the XT60. Lastly, you're going to need wire. I'm using 16 gauge for my main red and positive and negative leads, and I'm using a lighter 18 gauge for the motor braking circuit. On this mod today, I'm actually going to do something a little controversial, and that's use hot glue. Now, I am going to add an asterisk there in saying that this is high temp hot glue, or also known as professional hot glue. It has a higher melting temp, and it does require a hotter heating element and a stronger hot glue gun. So keep that in mind. I would probably recommend epoxy putty or super glue for anybody else that's doing this and you don't have a high temp hot glue gun, but I'm going to do that in this mod, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. I feel like hot glue gets a lot of shame in the hobby, and there's no reason for it if it's done properly. Now, again, if you're using a really cheap iron with standard hot glue, that can melt in a hot car faster than PLA. Plastic will even melt, so keep that in mind. But you could do the same thing I'm doing with epoxy putty or super glue, or a combination of both. We do have a kit on the website that's listed down below. Purchasing it obviously supports the shop and more creation of videos like this. It comes with the 3 lengths of wire, pre-cut exactly what you need in the blaster. It comes with the 2 switches, the heat shrink, XT60, and this switch plate. Or you can buy the switch plate separately, or you can source all your own components. Just for reference, this blaster has already been modified. I'm going to pull all of my modifications out and show you the entire process. My normal process for this would be to buy 2 blasters, mod 1, then start from scratch with the fresh one. I like to do this because it gives me more experience with the blaster before I teach you how to do it. If I just open it up and do it the first time, it's going to be a longer video, it's going to have less clarity, and things like switch plates and other parts wouldn't be done or completed yet. First thing we're going to do is take a number 1 or a number 0 Phillips screwdriver, and we're going to unscrew all of the screws on the blaster. This is the only one here that's a different length that matters. The rest are interchangeable. There was one that was slightly longer, but I found it fit everywhere else I tried to put it anyway. So only this one is a long screw that you need to be a little bit more careful with, but I had no issues with it overall. Once you've got all your screws out, you're going to pull your shell apart. You'll want to watch out for this guy if he pops out, and up top you'll have this little retention tab for the hopper, this little white guy. It likes to fly away, so just make sure you've got that somewhere safe nearby for use. When you first pull this off, you're also going to want to pull at least one, if not both of these tabs, or all 4 out. You can demolish this depending on whether your battery fits in here. So check right away. I was able to fit a pretty good size 1500 or even 2200 milliamp battery in this side and close the door. It has a perfect hole here that I just ripped this out with the pliers. I'll do one of these just to show you. You can either kind of twist and poke it back through like that, or you can kind of twist and yank it back up. Now let's go with poke it through. Poke it through is much, much easier. Now, should you want to, you could wire these terminals up top to an XT60 and somehow maneuver it in and out. I was never going to use standard D-cell batteries again. It's just a huge waste financially. If I want to lower performance, I'll throw a nickel metal hydride pack in, or, you know, as mentioned before, we'll do a 2S. All of my screws are already out, but you can choose to either tape these over so they don't fall out. You can pull them out. It's kind of up to you. Most of mine are already out, so I can flip mine over. Oh, there was one more screw. On the back side, you're going to clip this as you open that up, and I like to pull all this tape and stuff out of here. In fact, I can even see I didn't do a very clean job of pulling this, so we're gonna try cut that off. So you're gonna cut those leads out. All existing wiring in this mod guide is going to go for a variety of reasons we'll get into. Additionally, there's one more piece you're going to need to cut on this side, and that's the end of demolition for this side of the shell, and that's this tab here. You can cut it as low as you want, but it's not going to be useful anymore. It gets in the way of the interface of the switch because we are going to upgrade the switch. After that, you can set this side of the body aside. It's worth looking at these little vibration reduction tabs. There should be 4 of them. And I'm already like trying to figure out where this one went. It goes right here. So there should be 1, 2, 3, 4 of those, and the other side of the cage has them as well. So we'll set that aside. Next, we are going to remove all of this wiring. When this is stock in the cage, it's going to go all the way back here. This is a PTC, or a set of PTCs. This is also a PTC. PTC is a type of resettable fuse that clamps down on the current when the motor either stalls or is at high current. Now, if you're trying to maximize performance, you want all of this to go. Keep in mind, these were here as safety devices to not ruin your motors. So when you're using a blaster that no longer has these, like this blaster on 2S or 3S, you are going to want to be careful about, if you experience a jam, you're going to want to stop using the blaster, stop revving. This is something that kids definitely have problems with, so I wouldn't recommend modding this blaster and giving it to, say, a 5-year-old or 8-year-old or someone that doesn't understand rev then fire. That said, we will wire this to do rev, requiring the rev switch to be on before the firing switch will work. I am going to leave this PCB on the back here intact. It's got one small PTC that stops this motor from overheating. It doesn't seem to change the rate of fire wiring directly or removing it, so I'm not too worried about that. But the terminals were easy enough to solder to. You also could remove the board and just solder positives on the bottom, negatives up top, but that's ultimately up to you. While you're pulling your wiring out, you will need to remove the 4 screws on this cage. You don't need to remove the firing system, but you'll be able to pull the muzzle up, pull the cage out, you'll kind of bend it up and out, and then you'll pull all of the wiring. I also like to clip the solder on top of the boards that were on here and desolder and pull them off completely. We are not going to use them in this configuration to make soldering a bit easier. Luckily, there's lots of room in the blaster, and it's pretty easy to maneuver the wiring. Next, we're going to do the demolition. And again, as I've mentioned, you can see I've already cut this out. So the state it is in currently is exactly where you want to end up. You can do this with a Dremel, or as I actually did here, I used snips and flush cutters to get at this. This is a flush cutters. which, you know, as it sounds, it cuts, you know, flat and flush. This is snips. You can actually do it with either or both or Dremel, but we've got two things we're gonna do. First, look at this little screw boss here. You're gonna bring this entire square down to the level of that screw boss by clipping round and round. Should be fairly obvious. If you are using my switch plate, this does make the install of this switch very easy because this switch plate is going to simply pop down on top of that screw boss. It's got a little hole just for the screw boss, and it's designed to fit this blaster perfectly and seat your switch exactly where you're going to want to go. Now, if you're not using this, no worries, of course. Just do the same thing, but you're going to build up this whole area with epoxy putty or potentially a lot of hot glue. If you do hot glue, go slow, do several layers, let it cool in between. You can use a piece of metal to cool it, but I'd say epoxy is really the way to go there. And it's not a massive amount. It's not as bad as like the Nemesis, but I like to have this button switch sitting where it is just taking all the slop out of here so you've got no play on the trigger and activates cleanly. The way I designed this switch plate, it's got a back plate, so no matter how hard someone cranks on this trigger, they're never gonna push your switch out of alignment or screw that up. So hopefully you were able to see this switch plate should be glued in place. We'll do that in a second, but it holds pretty well without even gluing. Here's a close-up of what this area should look like when it's done. Basically, again, you're flush with that screw boss. Next, you're going to want to clear this area out. First, you're going to pull all the junk that came with it. Ultimately, I decided that a switch plate here was completely pointless. I'm sure somebody else is going to go make one, but I personally felt like it just wasn't worth it because it required more cutting, more dremeling than was necessary. I like to do switch plates when there's a lot of void to fill and where this actually saves time. And on blasters like the Strife and especially the Nemesis and Percy's, the plates really help. And I think the plate up here is very valid, but down here, it's like the Hasbro designers gave us a little gift. Look how perfect that fits right in there. So ultimately, that is where you're trying to get your switch. When you're doing this, you're going to want these to line up as straight as possible, like this. You don't want it to be sort of, you know, like that or like that, where it could slip off or slip. You want it to kind of keep that peg lined up here. And you will need to trim your peg with a flush cutters to get that in. So again, I'm gonna hold this up nice and close so you can kind of see what I've dremeled out. Again, this switch should fit nice and easily right in there. And that peg right there is where the little pin from the switch will go. I did like the lever switch on this trigger, not so much because of the lever, but this genuine Omron switch has a higher Newton rating, so the actual press of the trigger is a little clickier, which for the Rev trigger felt kind of nice. It is a larger trigger, so there's a little more mass to it, and since this is replacing your stock spring in the trigger there, that force on that actual button is important. I've decided that I am going to cut the switch just like I did before. I used a Dremel to do it the first time, but I think I can actually just stress fracture it by bending this back and forth. So let's give that a shot and see if it actually works. Nope, not yet. So there you can see that it did snap off just with 2 pliers, really easy, nothing to it. That'll ensure that it doesn't conflict with anything else. It may be possible to use the entire switch normally there, but I didn't do that on my test run of this entire mod guide, so I hate to make any changes midstream. So that looks great. That should sit nice and flush there. You want it to be kind of nice and level. Now we're gonna go ahead and actually install these switches. Now, if you're doing epoxy, you'd build up this area and mount your switch, but since I'm doing my little switch plate, I'm going to just throw, and again, you could do super glue, could be in this place too. Doesn't take too much because this plate is designed to basically hold all of this. Ooh, it's always nice when you get some hot glue on you. It's been a while since I've worked with hot glue. That's kind of fun. Now again, you could use hot glue right here. You could use epoxy. A lot of people have asked why I design these switch plates like this. I like to glue them in place because you're almost never going to remove them. Screws are not always feasible, especially with a plate like this. The hole that's below here does not have enough space, and where it lines up is just not the same place as where I would want, ultimately want a screw. So a lot of times I do them with these nubs and glue in place. So Like I said, again, you can glue this in place, no problem. I'll probably just continue with the hot glue. And again, it doesn't really take much thought or effort when you've got this switch plate. Pretty easy, but if you're doing this with epoxy and everything, that's where you want to end up. Feels good. Next, we're going to mount this bottom switch. This is our rev switch, of course, and this is the Omron that we cleaned up earlier. Kind of the same thing here. We're going to fill this either with epoxy. Again, I'm going to do this with hot glue, which you can see is very hot. The way this works, this industrial stuff, is you're actually melting the plastic a bit versus, and you do need to be careful that you don't use too much of it because too much thermal mass could actually mess up your blaster. But so you don't want to go overboard with it, but we're going to make sure that we get this all nice and lined up. That looks good. We're just going to hold that down while it dries. And you probably saw that it was actually bubbling. So rather than just being like a mild adhesive, it's actually melting the two sides. It's melting the piece of the switch and it's melting a piece of the shell. When I removed these with the hot glue, it held so hard that I actually broke the switches from the first one. So I could have been more patient, of course, but I literally ripped them open because of the hot glue. Now, if you're a little more patient, really great pro tip is this is inside this spray bottle, I've got rubbing alcohol. And rubbing alcohol removes hot glue amazingly well. You just spray it on everywhere, and the best part is it evaporates over time. So if you need to get the hot glue off, you just keep saturating it with this and it will essentially peel right off. And it's really, really a sweet trick. And my buddy Eli taught me this probably 5-6 years ago and I had no idea. So hopefully that was helpful if you hadn't heard of that before. The other cool thing about using hot glue in this way is that if you are patient, you can just spray this stuff all over the place and you can get your switches back out intact. Rubbing alcohol won't hurt anything in the blaster. Anyway, let's keep going. We've got our switches glued in place and this has been clipped and fits. We're now going to strip our first red wire and we're going to start with the XT60 that goes to the blaster. So our very first terminal is this guy here. This is actually going to be our XT60 connector, so it's going to kind of loop all the way back down and around over to the XT60. I'm going to put it in place here. Sometimes I like to just clamp that. Good idea to remember your glasses at this point for safety. And of course, as always, you're using lead-free solder. All right, and then we're going to let that cool for just a moment, but then we're going to bring this up and around. We're going to follow this path. Can go over or under there, sort of doesn't matter, but this is going to come back out through that hole on the other shell. So if you imagine you've got the blaster here in the cavity here, you're just going to leave enough room to give yourself a room on the XT60 connector. So I'll clip that about right there. It's sort of maybe an inch past the edge of this side of the blaster. So again, that'll be our XT60 connector, comes into the blaster, goes to our main rev switch, which will be the master on-off for the system. It will have to be triggered before anything else. Then we're gonna wire this guy, continue that same lead. So when this switch is turned on, the power will continue down this next wire. Now you'll notice I'm going to do as many of these without helping hands as possible. I like to just shove these in the terminals, even loosely if they're not perfect. Kind of wedge it, hold it in place. It's a lot easier than setting up the helping hands each time. Next, we're going to continue that same wire and it's going to go to the normally open terminal here. And we're going to want to kind of bridge that through. So what I'm going to do is kind of look where it is here. I'm going to either mark that with a Sharpie or just strip it in place. And I'm going to separate that a little bit. And what I'm actually going to do on this one is we're going to push this over the terminal. I find the easiest way if you're going to solder an inline on one of these terminals is to do this sort of thing. Hoping you can see that on camera, but I have essentially straddled the switch. You do want to make sure, of course, that you don't have any stray wires or anything like that, but then I can just sort of crimp this in place there. And, you know, it is battling me a little bit. I might have to use helping hands, but let's take a look here. I did end up grabbing helping hands here, so we're connecting to the normally open terminal here. and then that wire will continue to the flywheels. So essentially when you hit the rev trigger, that will power up the flywheels. It will also enable power here, but it won't turn this switch on unless you activate that switch. My theory is always to break the wire the fewest number of times as possible. Pretty much ensures that you're gonna have better connections. So now we're gonna pull out our flywheel cage. Now your flywheel cage should look like this. If you haven't got it to this point, you're going to want to snip off the tabs and desolder these. I like to use a little bit of solder to help flux and get that solder off of there. But once those are off, we're ready to actually wire our blaster in place. So it's always a good idea to keep in mind how this sat when you were done, because that wire path is going to have enough slack. The lovely thing about this blaster is that there's just tons of space in here. This is a big blaster. So I like to just kind of find a good place where this will sit in here. Make sure you've got enough slack, and we're going to run this up to the cage. Your positive terminals are these two terminals here, which are actually the ones sitting in front. They're the ones on this side, but when it's backwards, they are backwards, of course. So we're going to run that approximately like that, leaving us ourselves. Make sure that you've got enough room, kind of visualize and play out how that's going to fit. I think that should be about perfect, so I'm going to snip the end off there. I'll strip the end of that wire. You do want a tiny amount of slack in between here, but you don't really need that much because there's plenty of room in the shell. So I like to just measure and mark. Generally I'll use a Sharpie, but this will work just fine. Now again, here we're going to go with the same method as before. I'm going to kind of pull away that heat shrink there. You can take a knife or a screwdriver and just sort of shimmy those wires apart. This will give a little bit of a physical connection there on that terminal. Kind of pinch it together down on there, works well. On this one, I think I definitely will grab a helping hands just to basically press down there and hold that in place. And then we can solder that guy down. And then we'll solder up that last point. Always nice to give the wire a twist, keep it kind of organized. This one should be a little easier once we get it fluxed. Nice thing about these motors on the Mach-100 and the Rival series is that they've got plenty of room inside. They're nice big terminals. They're also protected by these plastic stay down ties for the motors, so you've got a lot of room to work and you're unlikely to touch the solder to anything that you wouldn't want it touching. Good to check that this does fit in there. Yep, we're looking great. We've got that play that I spoke about. Next, we're going to start from our XT60 connector, and we're actually going to wire our XT60 plug. So we'll go ahead and strip a good chunk of the end of this. That probably was not quite enough. And we'll give those a little twist. Now normally I would use helping hands or my soldering jig, but one of my helping hands has run off on me. If you don't own one of the fancy jigs that I normally use, a crescent wrench or any locking wrench like a vice grips works really well to just hold this in place. Funny enough, the base of it is actually kind of the shape of this thing. So we're going to throw our heat shrink on. Flat side is always positive, so we'll put that down in there. And if you do this just right, you can do it even without having a single clamp on it. Next we'll do the negative, same thing there. You could clamp these in place, of course, but I'm just using the tension of the wire itself, and it's the own wire's weight to do this. When you do a lot of modding and you're messing in blasters a lot, it's nice to find the quickest way to get anything done, especially if it can give you the same results without messing with clamping things down. Now we can slide that heat shrink back on here, and you can either use a heat gun or a lighter or the side of your soldering iron to actually melt these in place. And we'll go ahead and heat shrink those on. Next, we're going to take this piece of larger heat shrink We do include this in the kit, or it's a larger size on our site. I'm going to stretch it a little bit to fit over this, just so it fits over this XT60 connector. And then I'm going to heat gun that into place. That last step is not strictly necessary, but it does have a nice polished look. Now that the XT60 connector is done, we're going to take this same black lead, and that's going to go up to our flywheels. You're going to want to give this a little bit of extra slack, so I would probably do something about like that. There's, again, plenty of room inside here to get this closed up. And then I'm going to, again, give this a little bit of slack here. And I will mark this one with a Sharpie since I've got 2 places to cut. So I'll strip those 2 connections. And I'm going to do my same trick as before, where I'm going to sort of split the wires open on both terminals and kind of set those on top of here. And it looks like I can do that without any helping hands. Now we can replace that cage back into its original position. But first we're going to take this wire up top and we're going to actually run it down through these wire channels, conveniently here for us to use. These are literally for the same as the stock wiring. This wire is going to continue all the way to the back of your blaster, stopping at this switch along the way. So I like to tuck that underneath this wire here. So you can kind of pull that through. My piece of wire here is a little bit longer than yours would come in the kit, but if you're using your own wire, it would be pretty similar. So this black wire is going to tuck into this little channel here, and then both of these wires are actually going to cut straight over like this. It's going to feel a little awkward, but they can't line up with this, and they can't go under because this touches too close to the body. So these are going to kind of come straight across like that, and then you'll flip it, and that cage should seat nicely. And I hope that was helpful because it is one of those blasters that's a little quirky once you get in there. You can kind of manage any slack. Should you end up with any extra slack and you want this to sit nice and even, you could put it in there, but I'm not too concerned overall. Just want to make sure you keep it away from the actual trigger itself. Next, we're going to continue that same black wire to the normally closed terminal of our firing switch. This is what will turn our switch on and off. I will again mark that with a Sharpie, though you could just cut it. Again, we're not going to break this, just going to split it. And I'm going to run this kind of the same thing as I did on the other side, but the opposite. You do want to make sure that you don't have any stray wires that could potentially bridge the 2 terminals. That would obviously be a problem, but I'm just going to kind of, Again, you can use helping hands here. This is not totally necessary, but hopefully you can see what's gone on there. Definitely important not to have any wires touching, so do be really cautious with how you've got your wires actually laid out in there, and double check it after you've done the soldering joint as well. From that switch, we'll continue with that same wire, tucking it down underneath. There's a little retention tab right in here. You can actually shove it into that wire channel. It's going to be a little tight because it's thicker wire than it was meant to, but there's definitely room all the way along to make this work. You're going to want to watch here because there is a shell portion that needs to connect there, but there's another wire guide up top. So we can kind of work that in there, kind of tucking that down in. Then we're going to connect this to the top terminal here, which is our negative. So I'm going to give that enough room to kind of turn around and connect to there. This is definitely going to be a helping hands sort of situation. Now keep in mind this shell does need to close here, so it's going to have to be clear of that in its final location. And again, I did leave the board here, but the instructions are the same if you decide to rip the board out. I didn't see any obvious reason to remove that board, so I kept it intact. Our very last piece of soldering to do is soldering this yellow wire from our positive over here to this terminal here, the common terminal on the switch. This will actually power the motor, and it is the last thing we need to actually solder up. So we'll do that quick. I chose a lower gauge of wire here because there's no real necessity for it. The other one I left full 16 gauge because it was being broken in a couple places. It's just a little easier to work with, I thought. But there's definitely not that much current being pulled from this pusher motor. Nice thing about the 18 gauge is it goes right through the hole there. This is a repeat of before. We're going to shove this wire into all the same wire traps and terminals, tuck it down. Hopefully get it in the same one here too if I can. It's a little tight. You went in there before. Get in your home. I've pretty much broken my tab off there, but it's not going to hurt anything as long as the wires can reach. And we're going to leave a little extra slack there. Strip the end. We're going to solder this to the bottom terminal, and I'm just going to pull this up and point it out. And we're going to solder them to the bottom terminal, which is this guy right here. That's our positive. It's got a little plus next to it, making it pretty easy. Now, when you are soldering this, you probably want to avoid hitting any of the other components there if you're leaving the board. If you're not, it'll just be a bare terminal if you've pulled the board off. Either way is fine. While doing this, I decided to pre-tin this connector. I don't usually pre-tin stuff because I just don't need to, but it was being annoying, so this will make it a little easier to get in place where I want it. I'm sorry, I know it's very hard to see in there, but we're just soldering to. You can alternatively remove the motor, the whole assembly, and do this not in place, but I don't like taking out more screws than I have to. So if you do have any problems, you can pull this whole assembly out to solder instead. All right. And that sums it up for the wiring. That's all you need to do. There's no other work. These switches are glued in place, so we are set. We're ready to test and reassemble. I would always recommend testing with a low current pack to make sure you don't have any issues, but I'm going to say I'm pretty confident that this is going to be fine, being as it's my second modded blaster. So we're going to rev. I'm gently just touching these wheels to make sure that they are spinning this way. If that makes sense, the ball has to squish between them and go out. And then the next thing to check is to rev and fire and make sure that this is spinning. Don't be alarmed, this is going to spin away from the bottom of the trough. It works the same on the Percy's. So we have indeed finished the wiring here. Next, you want to place your muzzle back in place, like so, and you can go ahead and put your 4 cage screws back in place here, 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 and here. Lastly, we're going to put our shell on. You do want to make sure that this retention tab for that mechanism to close the door is on here. I am definitely going to work on a hopper for that because I think 100 rounds is nice, but more would be better. Since we pulled these tabs out, you don't have to pull them all out. You can do that. If you need to fit a bigger battery in here, you'll want to Dremel or cut this away. There's really nothing that can go too wrong here, so just hack at it as you will and you'll be fine. Lastly, we're just going to make sure we sandwich the shell back together, make sure everything closes up. And then I do like to do one more rev up test with the shell closed just to make sure there's no interference with anything. So kind of make sure your seams are all good all the way around. And we are good to go. Our very last step is to put all the blaster screws back inside. The largest one that looks like this will go here. And the rest are either the same size or close enough that they seem to fit everywhere. I've had no problems. I think there's one that's a couple millimeters long that maybe goes here, but honestly, it hasn't mattered so far. So I'm going to screw this back together. And there we have it. We have finished our blaster. I threw the 2S LiPo in here and it is ready to rock. Again, on 2S, you can expect to see around 120, 125 feet per second, a slight improvement over the stock form. However, with that 2S LiPo, you don't have to keep buying those 6D batteries, which do get pretty expensive. On 3S, you're going to get 140, 145, though again, I want to stress, I have not stress tested it. So keep that in mind. It might be that it burns out your motors or flywheels. We are working on looking at porting over basically a Jupiter cage or equivalent cage, Silphrina cage inside here with different wheels, but we have to do some performance testing before we come full circle on that. The one issue with the stock flywheels that are in here is that once you remove them, they never hold the shaft fit as well as the original time from the factory, so it can become a little bit more difficult to swap them, and it definitely takes either a pinion remover tool or a pinhole punch to actually pull those out. Thank you so much for watching. If you made it this far, we really appreciate it. I love doing the mod guide videos, but they are a substantial amount of effort, as I've said before. Whether I do them quickly or spend time researching and testing like I did on this one, they really do involve a lot of time and effort. So I would love it if you'd hit that like button on your way out and leave me a comment if you have any questions. Thanks for watching. Until next time, I'm out of darts.